Our moderator today, we've saved what is equally good as all the rest. An excellent panel, which will be moderated by Larry Garber, who is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Policy, Planning, and Learning at USAID. He's distinguished as having been a visitor to Texas A&M already. We really enjoyed his visit. He had a tremendous lecture to the faculty and students and was very well regarded. They asked him back even, so. Anyway, but Larry, carry on.
Thanks, Ed, and welcome to everyone. And this is the last of these panels, and I think we have a very exciting group of presenters and commentators to talk about it. But I just did want to comment on something that Joe Hewitt had said in the last panel. About the enormous amount of data that we receive and figuring out how to best make use of it. And it's a challenge that, I see every day in terms of, just what it is that I put my mind to read, or this, Joe, what it is I put my mind to read, which panels I get to go to, and would have liked to have spent a lot more time here than doing some of the things that I was doing the last couple of days, but it is part of our lives, and sorting that out and figuring out how we make use of data constructively, I think, is a big part of all of our agendas these days. As I said, we have an excellent panel, and we're going to do as we did the last couple of days, ask each of the panelists as they wish to comment on what they heard during the previous panel, and if you've already commented, that's fine, but if you have other thoughts, please add them. To summarize some of your own thinking around the subject, and again, the framing papers I found all quite interesting, and so to highlight some of the key points in them. We'll do that as an opening round, then open it up for questions from the audience, and then towards the end, I'm going to really try to shift it to, so where are the gaps? What can we do to fill some of the gaps in terms of research, in terms of the relationship that we now have with Texas A&M on the broad issue of conflict and development. So. That's the program, and we'll finish by 12:30 so everyone can get their lunch and enjoy the nice Washington sunshine today. So our panel is, we'll start with Steve Hagblade, professor of international development at Michigan State University, which is also another one of the HESN part of our network, so good to have you here. And again, the main thing that I took from reading Steve's biography is that he's been on the road an awful lot over the last 25 years in some incredibly interesting countries, and not just for short-time visits, but in terms of long-term engagements in those countries, including Botswana, Bangladesh, Cameroon, Madagascar, and Zambia. We'll then hear from Ellie Berman from UCSD, and Ellie's been doing a lot of work on, a lot of the things that we're interested in terms of counterinsurgency and development, the relationship between the two, also on political economy, and look forward to hearing his comments. And then our third respondent is Valerie Hudson, professor at University of Texas A&M, and again has been doing some very exciting research on gender and conflict and gender and development, and again look forward to hearing her comments on both what she heard the first panel and also where some of her research is leading her. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve for some opening remarks.
Okay, hi everyone. It's great to be here. I consider myself the token Aggie here on the panel, and so I'm going to address three questions revolving around agriculture and food security. The first one the organizers asked about is causal links between agricultural productivity and poverty. So I'm going to summarize the empirical evidence for you on that. Second thing I'm going to do is ask, so how do you generate the ag productivity in the first place? What kind of interventions are required to generate this stream of technology improvement? And then the third question is going to be, what happens in conflict situations, and how can we adjust, remediate to mitigate those problems? So the first issue about causal links between ag productivity growth and poverty. And there, what you need to know is, take a look at your right hand. The World Task Force on Hunger, broadly speaking, if you look at who are the poor and who are the hungry in the world, out of every 5 poor people, 3 of them work in agriculture. So what does agricultural productivity growth do? It directly raises the income of 3 out of 6 hungry people in the world. It's a direct injection to the right aorta. The 4th poor person in the world works in the rural non-farm economy. Now, what does agricultural productivity growth do for this 4th hungry poor person in the developing world? The answer is that it indirectly raises their income. And the empirical evidence that we have on this says that for every dollar in agricultural earnings, you generate 30 to 80 cents or so in rural non-farm income. So productivity gains in agriculture help the first 3 directly, as they build houses and send their kids to school and so on. They hire services from this 4th group. So you get indirect income gains here that are quite considerable. These agricultural growth multipliers are fairly substantial. The 5th poor person in the developing world lives in urban areas. Well, what does agricultural productivity have to do for this person? Well, the answer is that it lowers their food prices. Now, Ellie doesn't flinch when Starbucks raises the price of their cappuccino by $1, but this 5th poor person in the developing world is spending between 50 and 75% of their income on food. So one of the most powerful instruments you have for increasing their real income is lowering food price. So the bottom line on this literature on ag productivity and poverty is that it's the most powerful instrument you have in poor countries typically for reducing poverty, because you directly help 3 out of 5, you indirectly help the 4th one, and you indirectly help the 5th one who lives in urban areas. And the World Bank did a World Development Report in 2008 on this. There's really quite a vast literature. The rule of thumb is that agricultural income growth generates 2 to 4 times as much poverty reduction as income growth accruing in other sectors. So it's a powerful weapon, and as you saw from my background note, the poorer the country, the more powerful that weapon becomes, because poor countries tend to be more agricultural. So it's particularly in those settings that raising ag productivity generates very substantial impacts in terms of poverty reduction. So it's a powerful weapon. What's it take to get armed and moving forward in terms of ag productivity? So the interventions that are required, and three categories that you need to think about. First is assets, labor, land, livestock, primarily. If you're in Burma where half people don't have land, you can have wonderful new rice varieties, but half the people aren't able to use them. So asset and asset distribution is a key governor of agricultural growth and ag productivity. So assets is number 1. Second is technology. What does it take to generate technology? It's research, development, and extension. And here I would emphasize that it's a long-term business. SR52 is the maize variety that the Zimbabweans released in 1960, revolutionized maize production in all of Africa. Took 18 years of breeding. The new cassava varieties, TMS varieties, released in the late 70s, took 30 years of breeding. Breakthrough came when they crossed a wild rubber plant with domesticated cassava to confer disease resistance. That was a 30-year effort. Even once you get these new technologies out, you can't rest on your laurels because the fungi, the viruses, the diseases, the pests are evolving very rapidly. U.S. spends 60% of its ag research budget on maintenance breeding to combat wheat rust. So it's the technology piece. You need the assets. You need more productive technology, but it's a tough slog. It requires continuous investment over decades and even generations. You need long-term, sustainable institutions involved in doing this. The third intervention that's required, the third piece of this puzzle, you've got the assets, you've got the technology, you need the markets. A lot of new technology founders because farmers produce mountains of mangoes and then they can't sell it and then the things rot or the maize gets infected with aflatoxins. So you need markets and to provide incentives to use this new technology. And we talked a bit about that in the first panel. The interventions on the market side, you need infrastructure, you need information, the kind of things Michael talked about, and you need good policies. Lots of problems we see with trade bans, roadblocks, kickbacks, truckers' cartels. So the market piece, I think we know how to do it. Well, it requires some effort, but it's doable. So I think if you're trying to alter these trajectories, reduce poverty through agricultural growth, you've got to be looking at these three things: the assets, the technology systems, and the market systems. Conflict. Well, before we get to conflict, let's say if you believe that hunger causes conflict, then doing all these things, ensuring that livestock don't die, that people have land, that they have healthy labor, the kinds of things that we're going to hear about in a bit, child nutrition and prenatal care and so on. If you do all those things and you raise productivity, maybe you're going to reduce prospects for conflict. This could be a good investment in peace and stability. Last question, what if you fail and conflict? What does conflict introduce into this system? And the short answer is it's bad news. I would recommend you avoid conflict and prevent it wherever you can, because first thing it does is it destroys all these assets. As Tim was talking about the livestock, you get water points decimated, you get herds destroyed, you get diseases spreading. So you have it damages your asset base, it ruptures your market linkages completely, and it causes huge problems for this ongoing, slow-moving machine that generates ag technology. So conflict is a bad thing. It more or less stymies this whole ag productivity growth scenario dead in its tracks. So to remediate in a conflict or a post-conflict area, two things. First is, I would say, to think regionally. If you're in Bengal, okay, the Great Bengal Famine of the 40s, what did they do? They set up cordon fences and they blocked the flow of basic food grains. It was the biggest mistake they could have made. In a conflict situation, you want commodities moving fluidly. And so what that means is before the conflict, you need to have trade systems that recognize the legality of cross-border trade so that trading companies have trust and relationships in different places, because if Mali implodes, northern Mozambique has a regular surplus. If there's a problem in Ethiopia, Uganda can export maize. So if you have this kind of regional perspective beforehand, you can help mitigate the negative, pernicious consequences on markets post-conflict. That's true in the technology field too. Seed testing, seed release, foundation seed certification protocols, phytosanitary rules. You need to set those in place early on so that maize varieties developed in Ghana can be sold in Liberia. In fact, the reason Liberia is going to bounce back pretty readily from this long-term conflict is exactly that. They're pulling in technology from the surrounding areas. You can really help that bounce back occur more readily if you have harmonized these seed release, the fertilizer input regulations, so that the seed companies have offices in all these places, so that they have trade relationships, so that post-conflict those materials can get in. The last thing I'd say in remediation is that you're going to need to think about rebuilding assets. Could be livestock, could be water points, child nutrition, quite an important one. So you're going to need to think about assets and purchasing power in afflicted areas. This is a long discussion, and in a nutshell, you can remediate conflicts, but you're better off if you can avoid them. So I would urge you all to invest in those three ingredients. If agriculture is growing prosperously, you can avoid a lot of these problems in the first place, and I think that's your first line of attack.
Thanks, Steve. We'll now turn to Professor Berman.
Thanks, Larry. So my understanding of my job was that I'm to discuss the things that I heard so far this morning. And that looked challenging because this morning we heard about technology, about research, about trade, about P4P, and then Tim, the last moderator, just to make it simpler, introduced governance deficit and food security. And I think I'm also supposed to kind of give it a perspective from our understanding of research that we've done so far.
More than 10 minutes.
And I've got 9 left. All right. So let me try to zoom out first and then zoom in. I want to cover the theory of conflict. I want to talk about governance deficit, and then I want to come back and talk about technologies and how one might design programs. So, let me start with the theory of conflict and say as a preamble that we've been running a development and conflict research program in conjunction with some folks at Princeton and Stanford and Yale for about 5 years now. Jen and Mike have both suffered as parts of that little industry, and we just want to recognize their pain. So there's a theory of conflict, and it's very different from an economic growth theory. In fact, in ways they're extreme. In economic growth theory, starts with welfare theorems that say that when people and property are secure, then more stuff is always better, right? When you remove the security of people and property, then more stuff might make people much worse off because you provide incentives to people, to bandits and bad guys, to come grab your land or grab your capital or grab your crops or even grab your children on the way to school so they can extort from you the other good things that you have. And so, people say, well, hunger causes conflict in the absence of governance that can adjudicate disputes. Water causes conflict. Environmental problems cause conflict. Stray goats cause conflict in places where there's no governance to adjudicate disputes. And so coming back to something that what Tim was saying, we might think of this as some kind of governance as a precondition for anything that we really want to do to work. And that creates a real challenge. So that on economic development being very different from conflict mitigation. Now, in the theory of conflict from a political science point of view, there's I think a very revealing theory that was laid out by Stathis Kalyvas a few years ago in a wonderful book on civil wars. And what Stalthus basically says, I'm oversimplifying, is that you can think of civil wars or sub-state conflict in general as dividing countries into three pieces. There's kind of a part that's controlled by there's a part that's controlled by the government, where, Joe's part of the room. There's a part that's controlled by the rebels, Jen's part of the room. There's a part that's controlled, and there's a part that's contested, Ed's part of the room. And now we know that it's even a little more complicated than that. There's probably another part, maybe Michael's part of the room, where the communities are strong enough to tell the rebels and the government to get lost. They'll take care of their own problems. Thank you very much. They don't want assistance. They just don't want to see anybody else. Now, if we just think of those parts of the room for a moment, Joe's part of the room is easy. There are development professionals that know much more than me about this. You do what you usually do in those places. With a little exception, I'll come back to that in a moment. Jen's part of the room is also easy. If you're willing to work with the rebels, right, then you do the usual things, and you build structures of governance and all that good stuff. You might also want to place particular attention to empowering individuals, and especially the women and the children, because these rebels aren't usually Jefferson and Washington. They're folks who have governance structures that are themselves pretty repressive. But that's also true of Joe's part of the room in most of the places that we're talking about. Michael's part of the room is, one could take the same approach. One could say, well, the elders and the mullahs know how to do things by themselves, and so why don't we just support them and help them along and help them develop agricultural technologies and things like that, and that'll be fine too. And then Ed's part of the room we'll come back to. The only part that's serious, that's difficult about this, and this comes back to something that George was saying about how you deal with a pre-conflict situation like we now have in Afghanistan, is that when Ed's part of the room collapses, there's going to be a flow of refugees. And there's going to be and the patterns of trade are going to change. And all the other parts of the room are going to have to start taking responsibility for a whole bunch of people that they're not set up to take care of. And that has to be part of the story as well, in terms of development and conflict. Now I want to focus on Ed's part of the room, because we know a fair amount about it from our own research. So there are really two categories. This is maybe over the last 5 years, it's become very clear. There are two categories of sub-state conflicts. We tend to spend a lot of time thinking about what are now called asymmetric conflicts, where the government is much stronger than the rebels. And if the public feeds a little information to the government about what the rebels are up to, the government can take control. So these are the contested parts of the room, right? In an asymmetric conflict. In a symmetric conflict, where either the rebels are strong enough to contest the government on the same terms, or, so think of American Civil War, or both sides are so weak that it's kind of a dogfight in terms of the ability, neither side, given information for the public, knows what to do with it anyway, because they don't have the helicopters and the jeeps to go chase down the bad guys. There's actually not a great theory for them, but what usually happens in those equilibria is that the room gets separated very quickly, and there's not a contested space left that we ever go to. In any case, American involvement is almost always, and USAID's involvement is almost always in these asymmetric conflicts. So let's think about Ed's part of the room, a contested area in an asymmetric conflict. Now, what we know about those places comes back to this lack of governance, right? All ills seem to flow from these places. They're the ones that have the human trafficking and the food insecurity and all types of conflict and the drug smuggling and the kids who aren't inoculated. And why? Because, well, the governance isn't functioning. If you put things of value into those places, you run the risk of actually increasing the amount of violence. And we know this. We've got very strong evidence now from Africa, from 2 decades now of research, and we have recent evidence now from the Philippines. Rural Philippines, a well-governed place in the capital, not well-governed in the periphery. When Filipinos invest in peripheral areas, we see increases in conflict. There's increases in attacks on government and attacks on civilians. I'm talking about attacks in which people are killed. And so what we've learned, I think, in a nutshell from this research, is that if you're going to design programs for those types of places, you want to be extremely careful about the capturability and the extortability of those things in order not to provide incentives for, I'll be the bad guy in the story, for me to go beat up on Ed and his friends to capture the things that USAID just injected into that part of the world. And in fact, because we might not be doing Ed a favor by giving him that aid. Now, what kind of things are those? Well, some recent research we've done has highlighted some of them. We like to say modest, secure, informed, and conditional. Small projects, because small projects tend to be what Ed asked for, as opposed to what the international development specialists and the contractors wanted. Secure, which really means that you've got enough policing capacity to make sure that this thing is safe at night, and that the people who are attached to these things of value are safe at night. Informed, which really has to do with a debate that's out there that I can't help but rail on about whether it's enough to just spend money and in an attempt to displace the recruiting pool of the insurgents, or what you have to do is really provide something of value so that so that Ed really wants the government to be there, or someone to be there, right, who will control the space. Maybe it's the rebels, but someone who will help control the space. And conditional. Conditional, this is really the hardest one for development organizations. It says that we say to Ed and his friends, listen, this clinic that the nurse comes to inoculate the kids, if you don't keep the space safe, then the nurse isn't going to show up for work. And you understand the consequences of that. And so you're asking for some degree of collaboration, or for the resilient community, Mike's community, you're asking for them to keep to make sure that our nurse is safe, which really means keep the bad guys out, because the bad guys usually don't want the nurse either. And so now let me come back to the research part of this and to the technologies, which is also on our agenda for today. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes. 2 minutes is perfect for technologies. Technologies have allowed us to do two things that we really couldn't do before. One, and I want to come back to my role in life is now to discuss wonderful things that Mike Callan did. So one can do research in these places. One can do measurement in these places, partially because the cell phone technology now allows us to take pictures of things and transmit them very, very quickly. It allows us to do some of the things that I actually put out on the outline paper. We could have enumerators walking around, even in Mogadishu, when it was under the control of the other folks, with passive GPS in their pockets. And we can gather data in these places. So there's actually no excuse not to be doing research on these things. People say it's too dangerous. We don't believe it anymore. That also, by the way, means there's no excuse not to have measurement and evaluation in place for programs. Even in dangerous places, we know how to monitor the quality of roads in Afghanistan. God help me, I've spent a year of my life trying to figure out how to do that, and we can do it now. Right? We know how to enumerate people in these places. There's no reason not to be doing M&E here. Even though it's much safer to stay in the compound in the capital, we can show you ways of staying in the compound in the capital and still making sure this gets done. You don't have to take the word of your subcontractor for whether the program is being run or not. The other thing that I think is really important to say here is about agricultural technology, and I want to echo something that Steve was saying, and something I learned this morning actually from Ed. There are types of programs that are less extortable. If you think that someone's going to steal the crops, and crops are pretty easy to steal, especially on the way to market, right? You could switch to root vegetables, right? Root vegetables are great for conflict areas. Ed just taught me this, because it's hard to extort them, right? Well, that would mean that the kind of technology that you need is technology, especially in a pre-conflict situation, teach people how to grow the root vegetables. And that takes constant oversight, just like we do with our farmers here in the U.S. But we have technologies because farmers now in Afghanistan, in contrast to 5 years ago or 10 years ago, have a phone that can take a picture of the vegetable when it comes out of the ground. And if you take a picture of the thing that's eating it and you send it back to an ag research center, then you could have an expert take a look at that thing. We wouldn't dream of sending the expert to the place where he grows this thing, but all that's possible now with ICT. And the world has transformed because even the least empowered people in the world now have cell phones with which they can communicate with us, and we can try to help them out. That's my final point.
Great. Thanks very much. Looking forward to the questions and answer period, because I have a bunch of questions for both of you on the technology side of this, and whether it is as clear a solution as you're suggesting. But we'll save that, and we'll give Valerie Hunter a chance to offer some remarks, and particularly, I mean, I think we haven't heard a word about gender from either Steve or Ellie, so here's a chance to introduce this subject in this context, which I think is critically important. Go ahead.
Thanks, Larry. I'm Valerie Hudson from Texas A&M University, and I'm an academic. As a result, I do not have a lot of experience on the ground in Myanmar or in other places. However, I've spent the last 20 years looking at international issues from a gendered point of view. And I think that we've seen over the last several years that there's been a rising consciousness that it's very difficult to look at some of these intractable problems, such as food security, such as governance, unless you're willing to look at women as well. Because, to be perfectly blunt with you, food security, food insecurity is gendered. Think about the things that Steve talked about in terms of agricultural development, asset distribution, access to technology, who's in the rural areas, not to mention how many mouths there are to feed, fertility. Every single one of those things is utterly gendered, all right? So, for example, in Liberia, if you're a woman, you can't grow a banana tree. And the reason you can't grow a banana tree is because you have 2 X chromosomes. Okay? So even what you're able to grow in these countries depends upon whether you have 2 X chromosomes or an X and a Y chromosome. Okay? So I think if we're really going to be serious about food security, we have to also be serious about bringing gender in. Governance, my goodness, governance is gendered, isn't it? Okay? Access to power and decision making, even access to technology, is gendered. Ellie has talked about how when people in property are secure, you may do one thing. When people in property are insecure, you may do another. But you know, you're going to have to disaggregate those indicators of security, because there's plenty of places where men's lives and men's property are secure and women's are not. And you're going to face problems if we're only looking at half of the population. Let me talk a little bit about, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, because USAID now has significant ties with the State Department, and the Secretary of State's been Hillary Rodham Clinton for the last 4 years. In the first QDDR, I believe the word women was mentioned over 250 times. Okay, that Secretary Clinton was very invested in making sure that when we thought about any of these issues, governance, technology, security, agricultural development, that we were paying attention to the fact when we disaggregate indicators, we may see that something very different is going on with men than with women. Take, for example, who's actually doing the farming. Okay, one big question that we should be asking is who's actually out there in the fields doing the farming, and that's going to depend upon where you are. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa, it's the women out there doing the farming. And so, depending upon what area you want to do your programs, gender disaggregation, looking at things, what's going on with the women, is going to be vitally important. And I think one of the reasons for this is that in virtually all traditional cultures, the person responsible for actually keeping other people alive on a day-to-day basis are the women. It's not the men, right? The women are responsible for getting the water, getting the fuel, preparing the food. The sustenance from day to day to day rests upon the backs of the women in traditional cultures. They are the ones who are weaving the social fabric. And we have to have a lens on them. Because if we don't, I think that we get a situation such as, I have this wonderful quote from Donald Steinberg, of course now very important in USAID, and he was reflecting upon his experiences in Angola, trying to implement the Lusaka Protocol in the 90s. And he said, addressing an audience of African scholars on the Lusaka Protocol in late 94, I was asked about the role of women in its negotiating and implementation. I responded that there was not a single provision in the agreement that discriminated against women. This agreement is gender neutral, I proclaimed proudly. President Clinton then named me as a U.S. ambassador to Angola and a member of the Luanda-based Joint Commission charged with implementing the peace accords. It took me only a few weeks after my arrival in Luanda to realize that a peace agreement that is gender neutral is by definition discriminatory against women and thus far less likely to be successful. The exclusion of women and gender considerations from the peace process proved to be a key factor in our inability to implement the Lusaka Protocol and in Angola's return to conflict in late 98. This contributed to the return to another 3 years of fighting that ended only with Savimbi's death. Okay? So as we look at these things, as I've studied these things, I've kind of come to 10 takeaways that I discuss in my paper. And so I'll simply mention it. One is the war does not stop in a nation when the men have stopped killing each other and the men are safe. Okay? It's just not the case. I just finished last week this book, which I highly recommend to each and every one of you, especially all those who spoke in this conference over the last 3 days and never mentioned gender or women at all. Okay, so consider this as a top on your reading list. And it's called War is Not Over When It's Over. Women Speak Out from the Ruins of War. And this is Ann Jones from the International Rescue Committee, who has traveled to all sorts of conflict and post-conflict areas and asked the women what's going on now in your lives and in your communities. What's your perspective as women? And what she discovered is that when war is over for men, there's actually almost always a new wave of war for women, because the demobilization of troops brings home the violence to their communities and to their homes. And this means, as Ellie said, that monitoring, tracking, recording, publishing, and addressing gender-based violence that undercuts security is going to be key. One of the very interesting things that Anne did was the International Rescue Committee, when it visited each of these conflict areas, handed out cameras to the women and asked them over a month to take pictures of what they as women were seeing, all right, that people from the outside were not seeing. And when they would come back and download the pictures, a very different world emerged, okay, than what you would see if you were only visiting with, say, the village elders. I think, as mentioned, I think by Ellie briefly, another of the key areas that has to be included in any sort of support for fragile communities is support against trafficking. We've talked about how in these areas predators will arise, not just predators who are going to hoard food and manipulate prices. There are people who are going to prey on other people. And the most vulnerable, of course, are the women and their children. And so we have seen, ghastly scenarios where when families are insecure, daughters are sold, right? Sold as if you would sell a heifer. And so this kind of gender lens on what is needed is extremely important. Peace processes. When we talk about governance, part of what we're talking about is reestablishing governance through a peace process. But I think we've learned now that a peace process that is simply men with guns forgiving other men with guns about crimes committed against women doesn't work. And so needed as part of the governance scenario is women who have been empowered to make a difference in senior positions in security, both at the national level and absolutely at the local level. Okay? And it doesn't just mean pulling a woman in off the path and saying, okay, we've decided that you're the deputy police chief in this area. You know, that's not it. Capacity building so that these women can actually make a difference is critical. I think also whenever you're doing any sort of intervention in a fragile place, that we need to, in a sense, take a geographic perspective and ask how the spaces that we are organizing in our interventions are or are not safe for women. There's an entire literature that is built on the geography of displaced persons camps and how certain organizations of the camps lead to grave insecurity for women, and how others can augment security for women, make it easier. Sometimes when we do demining, we look only at the places where the men are going and not at the places where the women are typically going. And so again, I think a gender lens helps us. Security checkpoints are experienced vastly differently by women than they are by men. So what might seem to be a simple solution, establishing a security checkpoint, you have put a huge barrier in terms of the mobility of women, because they know that those checkpoints are a place for women to be corralled and assaulted. Okay, so even thinking about it, things that might seem natural, like security checkpoints from a gender area, is important. I think critically, two benchmarks that have to be part of any measure of success for supporting a fragile or post-conflict community are reproductive services and education for girls. If those two things are not part of what we're doing to reestablish governance and security, then I think it will be all for naught, because the social fabric will unravel again. Another thing that we often don't look at, we look at things perhaps like property rights. But what we don't understand is that for women, property rights are integrally bound up with personal status and family law. Okay? So what can a daughter inherit? What can a wife inherit? Okay? Those kinds of things are so integrally linked that if we're talking about things like asset distribution, and sustainable households, we have to look at how marriage law in a society affects women's ability to create a livelihood for themselves and for their children. I bet I'm almost out of time, aren't I, Larry? Or are you just being polite?
I'll give you 2 minutes.
All right.
But I appreciate your introducing this topic, so go ahead.
All right. Technology. One of the strongest forces for good for women is to give them cell phones, because it's true. They can take pictures. They can call other women. All right. They can try to establish networks that can be deterrents against gender-based violence. So anything that allows women to network more and more immediately is crucial, I think, for reestablishing gender security. When we talk about establishing, say, radio programming, all right? An intervention which has been viewed as extremely successful is radio broadcasts, not just in the language of the land, but also local dialects that advise women of their rights. Because what we have found is that in many very rural areas, women actually don't know they have any rights, say to land or to inheritance or even to education. And so everyone, men and women, okay, should be hearing radio broadcasts about what the rights of women are. And then I think finally, again, going back to Steinberg, which I think, gosh, he's been so eloquent on these issues. He said, in Angola, their motto for women became nothing about us without us. Right? So if we're planning these things and we're not including women, all right, not simply as counselors, but as decision makers, I think that our efforts will be far less successful than they will be otherwise. And recently, scholars have been proposing a benchmark of 30 to 40%. If 30 to 40% of those having input are women, if 34 to 40% of those in decision-making positions are women, that you will get a different result than if you had not achieved those kinds of proportions. And so I think I'll end there. Thank you very much, Larry.
Great. So thanks to all the panelists for both very clear presentations and for leaving us lots of time for discussion. And I'm going to take the privilege of the chair and start and follow up from Valerie's presentation with a question to her, but also would welcome Ellie and Steve's comments. So, Valerie, a lot of the things that you say, I hope are accepted wisdom now at AID and amongst others. From your research, from other work, why is it so hard for us to implement this? I mean, why is there that gap between, what the research is telling us along the lines that you're describing about how critical it is to, evaluate these issues in a conflict and in a development environment from a gendered perspective and the reality that you see on the ground?
I'm so glad that you asked that, Larry. To be honest with you, I will give you some answers, but I want to tell you that this question that you've raised so intrigues me that I'm actually writing an entire book on the subject. And so starting next month in May, I am doing a round of interviews with everybody that I can find, and I'd be happy to interview you too, Larry, about why we see such a gap. If we know these things, right, if we have seen stunning improvements when we take a gender perspective as versus when we don't, what are the barriers? Now, I already, in some of the interviews that I've done, there's a few themes that have emerged, but again, you'll have to wait for the book to get the final version. And one is subcontractors, okay? We here in this room might say, gender, yeah, I definitely get it. But you're hiring subcontractors maybe from India, Bangladesh, other places, and they're like, okay, gender, right. So your subcontractors are not invested in gender, and they're coming from societies where women are largely overlooked. Furthermore, they usually, from some of my interviewees, have told me that they engage in very bad behavior towards women. Okay? So I had one of my interviewees who said, yeah, all the men in my office would go down to Dubai, to the brothels, and they'd come back and they'd boast to the local men about what they'd done, all right? And the local men were like, hey, compared to us, these guys are pigs, so don't talk to us about gender, all right? So I think part of it is that, the people that you have on the ground in a subcontracting basis may be completely undoing our efforts, not simply in terms of them saying, yeah, gender, right, I'm really not going to pay attention to it, but also in actually modeling venal, awful behavior towards women and making that a matter of boasting to local men, who then view this whole business about gender as just utterly hypocritical, right? So that's part of it, I believe. I think another part is that I think even here in Washington, D.C., there's a sense that gender is a nice afterthought and not a foundational thought. So I think we're all familiar with the unnamed official who, when asked to comment about, we're leaving Afghanistan, what about all the women? And he said, well, gender was just one of those pet rocks that was weighing down our rucksack. So I think, the attitude again, which is, yeah, it's nice to talk about gender, but, when push comes to shove, it's roadkill, right? It's the first thing that's going to go, that we're going to drop, I think is an attitude that even here in D.C., we need to begin to correct. So that's just a couple responses. I could give you more, but I certainly don't want to monopolize the time here.
Well, great, and great advertisement for your book, but which we're all looking forward to. So let me just quickly...
yeah, past book, yeah, if you want to see the earlier version, Sex and World Peace, which I think is one of the best titles you could have, right?
So before I go to the floor, I'm just curious if Steve or Ellie want to comment on this particular issue, and then we'll take some questions on the floor.
Let me just try to amplify it in two ways. One is, the economics of gender discrimination in conflict spaces is pretty straightforward, right? The males are very much favored because they're the ones that are better at fighting. And I mean, if you take a look, for instance, at Cambodian villages after the genocide, after the Khmer Rouge, you find that families that lost their fighting age males were disadvantaged afterwards in the land grab. And so there's a reason that in these, males actually have a comparative advantage at this. And so the males are more valued. And that means that everybody that's not a fighting mate, this is the second issue, everyone who's not a fighting age male is disadvantaged. The old men, the little boys, as well as the little girls, are all disadvantaged in this space. And so I don't know how you solve it without basically solving the conflict. But if we were talking about the areas of the room, right? If I were a woman or if I were a little girl, I'd want to be in Joe's part, right? Because that's the refugee camp that the IRC is going to show up in. In Jen's part of the world, the IRC is less likely to show up.
Steve, either that or the question I was asking about, so why, if we know all this, why is it so hard for us to develop interventions that address, respond to the research that we have in this area?
Okay, can I take a stab at that? I'll start with my grandmother. My grandmother never wrote a check. She never had a driver's license. The only resources she controlled in life were a quarter. She gave piano lessons once a week, and she got a quarter per lesson. She had 4 jars, one for each grandchild. So the only resources she ever controlled in the world were these quarters and jars that she gave to each of her grandchildren when they graduated from high school. She was completely at the mercy of my grandfather, who was a nice person. The short answer to your question, why doesn't everybody just change to the way we treat women? And the answer is because it's a very revolutionary proposition. What you're proposing is social revolution. In poor countries, I worked in Bangladesh for 5 years. Suicide rates among women were astronomical. You have a stratified society, you have men under pressure, and they can't get enough food for themselves. The only people subservient to them in the social pecking order are the women. And so the violence against women was just unbelievable. So they would take Endrine or pesticides or jump into wells. It was a massive, massive problem. So we can come in and say, treat your women well and give them rights. It's a revolutionary idea. It requires some level of prosperity, I think, to make it happen. Which is ironic, because to achieve that prosperity in the first place, Valerie's really right. You need good maternal prenatal care, good nutrition, health care after birth. You need education for girls. So it's a kind of a circular problem, but it's very deeply embedded cultural problem that an AID briefing note's not going to solve. It's going to take a long, long time and economic progress, I think, for women.
Great.
But I'd like to point out that I want to push back on the notion that we must first focus on economics and only have women as coming down the pike later. I think even your grandmother, if someone, a women's cooperative, had taught her to open a checking account, that there may have been changes not only in her life, but in the economic prosperity of her family. I think there are simple, non-offensive interventions that can be made to really, really change things around. And the violence against women, let me just give you an analogy, okay? In Afghanistan, this is just a crazy analogy here. If women were all Christians and men were all Muslims or vice versa, and we had the level of gender-based violence against women that we had, only constructed as against the Christians or against the Muslims, people would be screaming from the top down about genocide. But when it's gendercide, okay, we're willing to say it's just cultural. I would like to suggest that we have enough human rights treaties now. Heck, Afghanistan even signed CEDAW and acceded to it without reservation. That the days of saying, one day, ladies, decades down the line, when we're all at peace and we're all prosperous, we will then turn to issues of gender discrimination and gender-based violence. That's not going to cut it anymore. So we must be smart and find interventions that are not offensive, but that can alter the landscape, enabling food security and good governance and other things that we know are affected by what's happening with the women progress.
Great.
Can I just agree with that? If you were accusing me of
No, I
suggesting
wasn't.
that wait, I'd like to
I think-
go on record
yeah.
as saying that
Good.
that we need to do that. It's to solve the prosperity problem, we do have to invest in women, and I think the key is to find inoffensive entry points. And I think
Great.
maternal prenatal care is one, vaccinations, nutrition programs, and so on. So I think there are entry points, but you can't just go in and say, you have to be strategic about how you go about this, I think. But it is really very fundamentally important.
And just to pick up on the 2 points, and we'll go to the audience, that I just want, because it relates to the broader themes of the conference and the presentations, is just also to reflect on the role of governance here and the role of technology. I mean, that's part of the theme of this day, but how those two, address the broader issues of conflict as well as the specific issues that Valerie's raising regarding gendering our thinking and ultimately our interventions. Go ahead.
Yes, Paul Summers from California State University, Fresno. In listening to the discussions here, folks, I thought of a potential research theme here along the lines of gender roles in farming systems. If one assumes that most farming systems probably developed during a period of stability in many of these cultures, and the gender roles were probably established for each crop. And as we heard from Valerie, of course, and we know that women do a significant amount of this work. But how do these gender roles change in farming systems in conflict environments? How do they change in terms of cropping structure, function of that farm, and the location of the crops? So Valerie, in other words, if women can no longer, for a variety of reasons, go out to their staple field or collect bush
that's
foods,
exactly
bush
what
meat,
happens.
does the home garden become much more important inside the walled compound of the Afghan household? Does that become much more intensively cropped because women can no longer, let's say, or in Africa or wherever? I'd just like to throw that out to the panel, maybe Steve or
That's
Ellie,
a
if you have
great-
some thoughts.
That is absolutely wonderful. And I think I'm just going to put in one thing here before turning it to the rest of the panel. One of the things that Ann Jones finds over and over again is that women have had to abandon their fields, right? They cannot go to the fields anymore. And so you're right. They're living on maybe, one meal a day that is gathered or grown as close to a point of safety as they possibly can.
So I wonder if the home compound then becomes extremely important. And again, we have an expert on cropping systems here. How does the structure and the function of that farm system in proximity to the home the residents change? Also the livestock.
So let's open it up.
That's
for
a research
other-
question.
Great. That's very helpful. Okay, we'll go here, and then since the microphone's there, and then we'll go over here.
Thank you. Chris Payne, also USAID. I think a great presentation. In terms of what Stephen and Valerie had said, Stephen, I was very interested in your kind of three categories, the importance of agriculture, and I agree wholeheartedly. What I didn't necessarily hear was the knowledge component. I'm thinking now experience that I had in Afghanistan and in Liberia, where you've got 3 decades of war in both places. the idea of how to be a farmer has actually completely disappeared in many cases.
Fascinating.
And now, a great big caveat there, I was always impressed with, with Afghan farmers. They did manage to stay alive for 30 years of conflict, right? So a huge kudos there, but otherwise you might say they're atrocious farmers, right? They have a lot to relearn, as it were. The same thing also now, the incredible importance of gender. Now, my experience was in southern Afghanistan. Maybe you politely say this is, a difficult environment to work on gender issues. We always, one of the phrases was, it's behind the wall, as the same thing that Paul said. Absolutely important that we work on that, but how, right? We're practitioners, we're policymakers. How do we really do this? One very quick anecdote. The office manager that I had in Kandahar, very progressive guy, working with the Americans, et cetera, was happy like all proud fathers to show me pictures of his kids. And I once made the mistake, well, I just asked for his wife's name, not to see a picture of her name. And he looked at me, he's like, well, I'm very sorry, I can't tell you that. It's completely inappropriate. So here's a guy who's working with Americans, who's happy to do all this. He's very progressive, but I can't even get a name. How in the world am I going to work on gender issues in southern Afghanistan? Thank you.
Let's go over here, and I'll give the panel a chance to respond if it's a specific question, maybe as comes up, but more generally, let's go.
I'd like to reiterate Steve's point and then reinforce Valerie's arguments. Steve mentioned Bangladesh, and I'd draw the example from Grameen Bank. 95% of the creditors in Grameen Bank are women, and they were able to pay their loans back. Yet, there is a huge income disparity between men and women in Bangladesh. And my question is why and how can they increase the income levels of women? Even if they're getting microfinance, the incomes are not increasing. Is it because the technology is not tailored for women, or is it because something else?
Okay, we'll come back. Go ahead.
Jerry, is this on?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Jerry Brown with the Institute for Economic Stability. Possible research topic in terms of technology and technology adoption is looking at market-driven sustainability of technology. So if you look at the cell system, right, which I think Professor Hudson mentioned is something that's been tremendously valuable, that was built without a single penny of aid. All right, and it sustains itself. People use it. It is arguably one of the best things that the Iraqis think they got from the invasion. To Professor Hudson's point, it's been tremendously valuable in places like southern Afghanistan where women can't leave the home. It would be interesting to look at technologies. We tend to look at technology. I think someone referenced new varieties of rice, where we tend to deliver these things and hope that they'll sustain themselves without trying to find a business model that will make them sustainable. It would be interesting to look at technology adoption, not just in terms of how we get it in the field, but what is the business model and ongoing, how do we capture the value that's created so that we can keep it going? And the answer is, the business model is not, well, hopefully you'll come back next year and give us more varieties, which seems to be the business model of a lot of the projects we do. And it would be worth looking at what made the cell systems work, because they were tremendously successful without a single penny of our aid. And as a matter of fact, they generated revenue for the government.
So why don't we go, one more question here, and then we'll go back to the panel. Got a microphone? 1 second.
Mirza Johani from the Aga Khan Foundation. Firstly, can I just thank you for perhaps the most rewarding 1 hour I've spent since being in Washington over 3 years. This was a really excellent presentation on some core issues. The one thing that doesn't come through clearly, for me at least, though, is the question of time frame and how it relates to what one needs to research on. If we are talking about technology and a new seed variety, hey presto, we can do that in a year. When we are talking about governance and conflict, the time frame becomes very different. And I wanted to understand what the panel felt about that. Now, the other point I would just make is that we would need to be careful that coping strategies in conflict are not seen as solutions. I mean, women do an incredible job in making sure families survive through conflict. But all of it, in my experience, has been about coping strategies. And those should not be seen as solutions, because the fact in conflict with women is that the burden increases enormously. Because you know what happens in conflict? It's the men that get out of the villages or go away in rebel groups, etc. Who's left at home to look after the family? And that's just a coping strategy. Yes, you could research and understand that better, but that's not the solution.
So we have a bunch of questions, including some interesting research ideas. Let me start, Ellie, maybe with you on this issue of timeframes and governance. How do we look at that? And has there been research done on this issue? We run into this all the time. Our timeframes are usually quite ambitious, and the reality is that we know if we actually take a step back is, that it's not, something that's going to happen in a 6-month, 9-month period. So how do we cope with this as a practical matter, and is there a research topic that we can frame around this conundrum, in a sense?
Thanks, Larry. That's the hardest question.
No, we'll start with that one.
Well, let me kind of, there's a massive literature on this, on nation building and establishing governance, and of course, it's a long-term project. Let me just talk briefly about, there are positive examples. There's a part of Palestine which is now pretty well governed, which was in utter chaos. Larry knows this better than I do. In the period of the Second Intifada and for years afterwards. And basically the government got its act together with a lot of conditional international aid, and in succession, security, tax collection, and legal system. Now, they've kind of plateaued the last couple of years in terms of the quality of services, but there's no doubt that the quality of services by any index that we would look at, including the treatment of women and including domestic violence, has improved dramatically over a period of about 6 years. Now, there are other problems going on, and it doesn't solve everything in the Middle East, but there are these examples of basically improving the quality of government in kind of a nuts and bolts way. And part of it had to do with, there's still an active debate about this, because this was the American government under the Bush administration forced the Palestinians to have elections. And that had some positive effects and some negative effects. The negative effects were very much felt in Gaza, which was taken over by the rebels. But within the West Bank, there was this idea that what you had to do if you wanted to win the next election was actually provide decent governance. And that was, in fact, transformational. And so, and it's inspired, I think, a lot of the, Mike was talking about research on elections. And Jen has done research on the service provision that's provided by rebel organizations. The fact is the rebel organizations, and in some case, you might prefer them to the governments, don't really have the ability to scale up and provide what we would call, liberal democracy in the Western European tradition. They're not set up to do those kind of things particularly well, and when they try, they usually fail. And so, yeah, it's a long path, and it's a complicated one, and you would need a lot of international support, but there are positive examples. And I agree with you completely on the first statement you made, though, that most of our discussion so far has been on mitigating the ill effects of the conflict that might happen in the contested part of the room. And that is a different agenda. It's really kind of short and medium term fixes, where what you're trying to do is build a long-term fix.
And I think if you're designing research, how do you stage it? What do you do as a research group, as a research lab, in analysis of conflict that says, this is the sort of direction of research that takes you to a solutions path, which may be more than 5 years and will be more than 5 years. But in the 5-year time frame of USA, you've got sufficient results to be able to show progress. You know, that was what I was trying to get at.
Can I take this one as well? Yeah, quickly. So I think there are three things. Because you want to worry about the short time frame as well as the long time frame. This pre-conflict situation, which I think is the nightmare that we're all thinking about in Afghanistan. What happens when the West pulls back? Can you prepare these communities for what they're going to face? That's a very important research question. It has to do with agriculture, and I'd put it at the top of the list. But the second is, in the longer run, finding ways to balance the rapacious nature of the government that's going to arise there, using cell phones as a transparency mechanism, to somehow empower people who are really not going to be empowered through elections that are going to be corrupted anyway. That's number two. And number three is that the basic nuts and bolts measurement of outcomes is common to both of those agendas. It's really, it doesn't befit us to say it's a conflict zone, who can do measurement? No. Research starts with measurement of outcomes.
I'd just like to say that I'm very grateful for what you said about how we cannot allow coping strategies to become reified as the new norm. Because, as you say, in addition to the tremendous burdens that women have and a new norm of men don't have to worry about anything in the household, I think we also get really horrible norms in terms of gender-based violence. I mean, in DR Congo, it's plain that even in areas that now see peace, rape has risen because of how vicious and how prevalent rape was in the war zones. And so even men who were not part of the rebel movements are now seeing that rape is a new norm and that they can act with impunity, and that maybe it's a testament to their manhood. So I would even suggest that this is something that should be an object of study, which is what can be done to try to prevent these new evil norms from congealing and becoming set. What sorts of things can be done to sort of change that path, nip it in the bud, and not allow it to go forward? So thank you for that idea.
Steve, a number of the questions were addressed towards agriculture and research opportunities. I wonder if you could react to them and offer any other thoughts on the questions that have been raised. And we'll have one more round of a couple more comments.
Okay. Try to pull a few things together. I think Paul had a good idea. And it's linked a little bit to Chris's question about the impact of conflict on farming. I think it's a good idea. As a good academic, I'm happy to recommend more research. That's how we all earn our livelihood. So count me in on that score. I think it might be good to broaden it a bit. I think the gender issue is important, but I think there are changes in agriculture more generally that affect women and men and children. Child's labor, I think, would be a big consequence. And I think we already know a fair bit about that. Ellie's point about root crops is really very important. You'll see that I took the precaution of giving you my picture in the middle of a cassava field. In conflict zones, it's hard to beat cassava. It's a root crop. You can harvest it after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, sometimes 4 years. And so in conflicts, farmers plant more cassava. They can hide the fields. Nobody's going to take the time to harvest this. It's stored right in the ground. And then they come back next year, the year after that. It's a really valuable coping system. And if you get the new varieties, you can even turn that into a growth story as well in peace times. So I think root crops deserve probably more attention than they've gotten. And probably goats deserve more attention maybe than cows. I mean, I marvel at the staying capacity of goats. And there's some breeds that are very high milk producers and so on. So I think... Yes, some research, but I think also some application of what we already know about the kinds of agriculture that can help raise productivity, nutrition, but also provide resilience to the system. Jerry's question was a really good one. ICT is privately funded. Why can't ag research be privately funded and have a sustainable model that doesn't depend on Larry's checkbook running out?
It's getting smaller and smaller.
Right. It's a good question, and the answer is that for hybrid crops, yes, private sector research can work because the farmer has to buy new seeds every year, and the company can make money, pay off their research by selling seeds every year. But with cassava, no private company will ever invest in cassava research or sweet potato research. These are vegetatively propagated crops. Even closed pollinating crops like cowpeas or soybeans or others, what you find is that when farmers can recycle seeds, rice is maybe the classic food crop here, that you do the research, the farmer gets the new seed, and then he saves seeds and replants. He doesn't have to go back to the store every year. So there's a big segment of the ag research system that is public goods. The private sector, there is not a sustainable private sector model for these vegetatively propagated and closed pollinating crops, nor is there for control of contagious diseases. So there is always going to be a public role in the ag research front, and the sustainability question really is driven by, I think, political lobbies and sustained public support for these public institutions that do the research. And part of the problem in many developing countries, here in the US, we have 4% of the population, and they have the politicians by the throat. You go to many African countries, you've got 70% of the population in farming, and they don't even have a voice. There's a real asymmetry in terms of political power, but it's that political farm lobby power that brought around the Hatch Act and the Morrill Act, and in Denmark that brought universal agricultural education and so on. So there's a governance issue kind of at the grassroots that translates into political funding for these very nuts and bolts public goods that really require, as I said, decades and even generations of sustained public financing. So there isn't in general, a private sector model for ag research. The last question about why are women poor in Bangladesh? It's one of the most painful things I've ever had to witness and be around. And why it's complicated. They have few assets, limited mobility. Good Muslims wear the burqa. You're constrained in very many ways. It's clearly a male-dominated society. They're discriminated against at many levels, and so it's not surprising, given these constraints, that they have less opportunities now. Some of the best things you can do for women is to open garment factories. You get young women, and some of my good Bengali friends were aghast because when these young women that work in the garment factory, you can't wear a burqa, so you have to show your face, and they brazenly walk to work every day. And not only that, the cosmetic companies start advertising. And this is the world going to hell in a handbasket, because not only are you failing to cover yourself, you're trying to make yourself beautiful. So this is kind of a revolutionary activity, but I do think the garment companies have made quite a big difference, because it starts to change women's perceptions of themselves and changes their purchasing power and so on. So it's going to be a long-term process, but I think these cash for education tied to girls' education is a good thing. There are things you can do to help turn this around, and Bangladesh is a place where you really need to turn it around faster than elsewhere.
Joe, did you have a comment, question? Okay, I thought you had a. Is anyone else or Well, let me just throw out one other idea. Like Tim on the previous panel, who was moderating the previous panel, he's seeing everything through his current AID lens of resilience. I'm seeing it through my current AID lens, which is local solutions and country system strengthening. And we're investing a lot of effort into trying to be truthful to the aid effectiveness agenda that has been articulated at various forums, and again, taking into account the different perspectives that are out there. And I must say that, it just came, the reason I was late this morning was we had our weekly meeting of our country system strengthening working group, and, till now, we haven't really introduced gender as a concept of how we deal with it. But I just, we've touched on some of the governance issues and some of the political economy issues, and I just wonder if any of you would like to reflect on, how this idea of, system strengthening is informed by some of the work that you're doing, or some of the themes that you've highlighted or have been highlighted in the conference today. So I don't know if, Steve, maybe you can start, since you introduced it a bit when you were talking about market systems and the like.
Yes, well, local solutions, strengthening systems, I would urge aid to think regionally. Forget about countries, particularly in Africa. These are drawn in a map in Berlin in 1885 by people who'd never been there, didn't know what they were doing. The borders are completely artificial, highly constraining. They cut across agroecological zones. They cut across natural market sheds, transport corridors. So when you think about strengthening systems in Africa, many places in Asia too, you need to think regionally. And I would start with the productivity side. You need to think about regional research networks. You need to think about regional seed release protocols, seed certification, phytosanitary controls. That's how your systems are going to rebound. There are scale issues in terms of efficiency. Africa can't fund 54 state-of-the-art ag research centers. These countries are very small. They do need to collaborate. You look at West Africa, a map of West Africa looks like a series of phone booths side by side, these tiny little narrow countries. Well, you need to blow the doors off those phone booths so that seed developed in Ghana can spread right across to Benin and even Nigeria. So I think if you think regionally and you develop these kind of nuts and bolts technical systems for releasing seeds and transferring, then all of a sudden you've stabilized a whole agroecological zone. And then the same is true on the market side, that you need to think regionally. The problem of the Sahel that Tim talked about involves migration and trade of cattle north to south, cuts across 3 or 4 countries always. So those free trade agreements that are on the books need to be enforced, and the default needs to be open borders. If you did those two things, if you had regional research systems and good regional trade systems, you could solve a lot of Africa's problems. So think of local, sub-regional geographic groupings, and I think you'll go a long way, particularly in Africa.
Great. Ellie?
Yeah, so I agree completely that the idea of thinking nationally doesn't always make sense, especially in places where, the capital is only controlling part of the country anyway, and the rebels are controlling part of something else. Now, but trade and infrastructure and tax collection still matter. The infrastructure and tax collection still matter very much, because the ability of the government to govern the parts of the country it wants to govern, all come back to their ability to collect taxes. And the better they are at collecting taxes, the more they're going to want to expand it into other parts of the country. Now that's going to create some conflict, but it might mitigate some other issues, including treaties that the government has signed on that we would like to enforce, and including our ability to work in those parts of the country. Infrastructure, I mean, it's hard not to come back to Afghanistan, where we invested heavily and built infrastructure, which is going to start falling apart. And that's going to change that's going to change trade within the country. So now, it quite amazingly maybe, Afghans trade across between these different sectors of their country all the time, right? In fact, when one of our researchers wanted to get their surveys out of southern Afghanistan and back to Kabul, they just put them onto the watermelon guys. We're happy to carry them for them, and for a little money, they would just carry the surveys back. So the watermelon trade doesn't really worry about that, and it doesn't seem to be extorted terribly. But Kishore talked a lot about trade, and it's a topic that we should really that we should come back to. Trade is a national decision. How the tariff system is going to work, even in places that smuggle extensively, the tariffs still matter, and the subsidies of the next country over still matter a lot. And it's true, when the Pakistanis stop dumping flour into Afghanistan, then this urbanization, which we accelerated, is going to have to reverse itself, and people are going to be moving back into rural areas. I just want to underline this part because it's a systems issue. It's a national systems issue. The Afghan economy is dramatically distorted by the fact that the West is pumping in money now at a level which is about the same as GDP. That money goes into the urban centers, and that's why all our contractors huddle around the places. And the urban centers have expanded with these massive kind of slum expansions. Those folks are going to go home when the money stops being pumped into those urban centers, and especially Kabul and Kandahar are going to depopulate, and all those people are going to go back to rural areas or back to refugee camps somewhere. And just in terms of the necessary mitigation, this is a really big deal, and it's an agriculture rural issue that really has to be dealt with again at a systems level. The other last thing to say, coming back to trade, is that, yeah, Kishore's right. There are winners and losers from trade. Trade can empower, if Afghanistan goes back to what it should be, which really is an agricultural good exporting place and an unskilled, labor-intensive exporting place, then open trade would be a good thing. But there's going to be a transition in which I think open borders would probably be a bad idea, to the extent that you can actually enforce what's happening at borders anyway, because right now Afghanistan survives by being a net importer of lots of things, including first and foremost food. And so to try to protect Afghanistan's food, you have to think about the farmers and the consumers as different problems, right? Feeding Afghans means you want cheap food to be able to come in, but governing Afghanistan in terms of the incentives that Kabul has to control parts of the country, or that anyone has to control, means that you have to make sure that agriculture is valuable enough that it generates tax revenue to make it of interest to the national government. And so all of that has to be part of the story.
Valerie, last word.
Yeah. Well, Larry, there are big systems, but there are microsystems. And sometimes you can heal the big systems by looking at the microsystems. And let me tell you that women faced with the daily task of provisioning their families and helping them to thrive create systems. And these are systems that potentially can be piggybacked on. Let me give you an example from Malawi. In some areas of Malawi, well, as you know, Malawi is one of these countries that has really high maternal mortality. And in some areas of Malawi, well, let me back up again and say, in addition to high maternal mortality, marriage is exogamous, right? So the girls are leaving, they're going to their husband's household and so forth and so on. And within that household, there's very few people who actually care about the girl. And so I think that feeds into maternal mortality, because nobody really is going to invest in prenatal care for that daughter-in-law. And so in some communities, there had been, recognizing this problem, the women had formed something called the Secret Mothers, where a particular woman, usually elderly in the village, would attempt to get the girl prenatal care and stand up to the family and say, look, if you want sons, you got to invest in this girl. Well, the government, of course, under Joyce Banda, has said, this is a terrific system that these local communities, these local women have developed to try to get prenatal care for these daughters-in-law. Let's take it nationwide. Let's have a nationwide system of secret mothers. And so they've rolled this out, and they've done, studies that have been able to show that maternal mortality decreases in villages where the secret mother program has been introduced. So when you're talking with your group, Larry, I think one of the things you should say is, what are the microsystems that women have already built to keep people alive, right? And see if you can work outward from there, as well as working from the top down and more macro level approaches.
Great. Well, thanks very much to the panelists. Very lively discussion, very interesting discussion. Hopefully provided some of ideas for the center in terms of future research. Certainly several countries were mentioned, several themes were mentioned. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Ed.
You've been a tremendous panel. Thank you very, very much. All the panels today have been great, and all the panels for all 3 days have been really wonderful. We really appreciate the enormous contribution that the panelists have made, as well as those who've made this workshop possible: USAID, Texas A&M University, and the Howard G. Buffett Foundation that have supported us so well through this. I wanted, I would like to ask Vince if he could introduce our audiovisual people. We've not known them by name. Okay. Okay. Well, let's give them a round of applause because it's. Thank you very much. And as on previous days, the workshop is not over until it's over. And so we will, even though the public, so we've finished with this session, and with the public sessions of the workshop, I would like to ask the panelists, those who can, from this morning, to gather here again at 2 o'clock and let us go over, synthesize some of the ideas, and that will be from about 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. If you're a panelist and you just simply can't make it, that's great. You've done your duty, and we'll gain from you already, but we hope that you can join us again from 2 to 3. For everyone, lunch is on our own, and just those that we've asked to come back, we look forward to seeing you at 2 o'clock. With that, we'll close the formal session of the workshop for the last 3 days. It's been tremendous. Thanks a lot.